In 1969, a guy in a cardigan walked into a room full of hostile, cynical politicians. The U.S. Senate was getting ready to gut the budget for public television, and the chairman of the hearing was a notoriously gruff politician who had already made up his mind to kill the funding. Then Fred Rogers started talking. He didn't yell, he didn't use slick debate tactics, he didn't rely on any political spin. He just spoke with this quiet, absolute sincerity about the emotional lives of children. Within 6 minutes, the chairman was visibly moved. He looked at Rogers and said, "Looks like you just earned yourself $20 million. That is real charisma. It's what happens when someone is so fundamentally, undeniably good that a room full of people who normally can't agree on anything are suddenly pulled in the exact same direction. The arguing stops, the posturing drops, and everyone just aligns, as if there was never any question about what the right thing to do was." We usually treat charisma like a dark art, a tool for smooth talkers and manipulators. But Confucius believed that genuine human-heartedness had its own magnetic pull. Today, we're looking at a short phrase from the Analects that breaks down exactly how this moral gravity works, and why true character never stands alone. Exploring the Analects, Episode 5. Passage 425. Won't you be my neighbor? Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 5 of Exploring the Analects. Today we'll be talking about Passage 425 of the Analects, a 6-character phrase focusing on the relationship between behavior and community. In case you're just joining us, here's a little bit about the podcast. We're discussing the Analects, a collection of hundreds of passages focused on the philosophy and teachings of Confucius. These passages were written and compiled by followers of the Confucian Way in China between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. They touch on a whole range of topics that can still teach us how to live our lives today. In each episode, I introduce a passage, give an informal translation, read the Chinese, then provide a more faithful translation. After that, we talk about the meaning of the quote with historical and cultural notes, and then I discuss language points for students of Chinese. Finally, I comment on the passage's place in the Analects, as well as any varying interpretations that might not have fit in elsewhere. Now that that's covered, let's get started with my informal interpretation of 425. These interpretations tend not to stick to the Chinese, but they do capture something about its spirit that I think will help you make sense of the phrase. I liked last episode's quote from Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood so much, I decided to go with one from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood this time. After all, this episode is all about neighbors. So anyway, here it is. I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. Won't you be my neighbor? Next, I'll read the quote in modern Mandarin, then follow up with a more faithful translation into English from Professor Edward Slingerland's book, Analects, with selections from traditional commentaries. 子曰：德不孤，必有鄰. The master said, "Virtue is never solitary. It always has neighbors." This is a statement about the attractive power and social nature of de, or virtue. And we're going to spend almost this entire episode trying to define "de," just so you can get a handle on it. So buckle up, here we go. Let's dive in a bit deeper and discuss some of the ideas behind this passage, along with some philosophical, historical, and cultural context that you should have in order to really grasp its meaning. For the first time in this podcast, we're seeing this character, "de." In terms of the key vocabulary for understanding the Analects, this one is right up there with 君子, or exemplary person, which we discussed extensively in episode 1. As with any of these key terms, they can take quite a bit to get a handle on. And for me at least, that lack of easy translation is really half the fun of digging deep into the classics. Typically, you'll find "de" translated as virtue, morality, or kindness. But if we're going to capture the essence of the quote above, we need to account for its community building and attractive power. In my opinion, regardless of how virtuous or kind a person is, it's not really an indication of whether or not they have these other social qualities. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's far better to be virtuous than not, but these days, it seems like it's always the people who are on their worst behavior that make the most friends. So I've been busy searching for something else, something that expresses not only a type of moral rectitude, but also the power to win friends and influence people. And I've landed on moral charisma. In modern English, charisma doesn't have much, if any, of this moral dimension. But if you reach back a bit, you'll find that this almost supernatural power to attract others is rooted in the idea that heaven can gift individuals the power to bring good into the world. And that's strikingly similar to this idea of "de." Now, I don't want to give you the impression that this is the only or even the best translation of "de." I pretty much guarantee that I'll end up translating it differently as we work through other passages. And virtue is going to make a lot of sense in some of these contexts. But for the purposes of this passage, let's keep the idea in mind. Let me give you a little context on why I landed on moral charisma. Charisma has its roots in the ancient Greek practice of charis, a type of reciprocal gift-giving between humans and the gods. I loved Greek mythology when I was a kid, but I'll be the first to admit ancient Greek religion is far from my area of expertise. But here's what I understand about charis. Essentially, it was the belief that if you prayed and sacrificed to the gods, they would bestow gifts upon you in return. You might see better health, luck, wealth, or any other number of blessings. By the time of the Hebrew prophets and through to the Christian apostles, charis had been adopted and transformed into charism. Charisms were specific powers bestowed by the Judeo-Christian God upon spiritual leaders. Abilities like prophecy, leadership, pedagogy, and healing. Through the Enlightenment and into the 19th century, charisma developed into a more general, though still somewhat spiritual idea of talent or virtuosity. You might think of the musical genius of Bach or Mozart, and people believing that this type of genius was a God-given gift. There was one final development to take us to the current usage of charisma, and that was in the early 20th century, when German sociologist Max Weber introduced the concept as we understand it today. In his work, it's used to describe a quality in a leader that inspires others to trust and follow. Now that you've got a bit of background on the historical, religious, and modern meanings of charisma, let's get back to "de." Off the bat, I'm going to mention we are not going to be able to square this whole spiritual power thing with Confucianism. Confucius was pretty firmly focused on everyday, worldly concerns. So the closest we're going to get is that duh is associated with heaven. I even mentioned this in episode 4. In passage 7.23, Confucius proclaims, "I have been endowed with duh by heaven itself." But the power associated with duh is a purely moral force. Confucius didn't claim it had a spiritual power or that it could be channeled for healing or prophecy. But where it does align with this religious meaning of charisma is that this moral force comes from acting in accordance with the will of Tian or heaven. And Confucius did believe that an accumulation of duh in an individual was what gave them the power to attract, rectify, and lead others. There are a few famous passages from the Analects that explain the charismatic power of duh. In passage 2.1, Confucius sums it up by comparing a leader with strong moral charisma to the North Star. He says that a great leader is like the North Star, since it does not move, and all the other stars pay homage to it, meaning that they circle around it, as if it's their moral center of gravity. In passage 1.1, which may be about as far as you got if you ever just sat down and tried to read the Analects, describes the pleasure of having friends come from afar. This idea might seem self-evident. I mean, having friends come visit us is usually a blast. But it's more complicated than this, and it's really best understood in the context of moral charisma. People from far away are only going to make the effort to come visit you if your duh is strong enough to attract them. There's one final aspect of duh that I haven't mentioned yet that you really should be familiar with in order to make sense of this phrase. And that's the ability for any individual to cultivate it. The Analects isn't too clear on exactly how one cultivates their moral charisma, but we can make some pretty educated guesses based on the core values Confucius comes back to time after time. Things like human-heartedness, filial piety, wholehearted devotion, honesty and sincerity, and so on. For the purposes of 4.25, just keep in mind that you don't have to be born with duh. You can work to build it up. I've been talking for a while, and maybe you forgot the phrase, so let me read the translation again to remind you what we're working with. Virtue is never solitary. It always has neighbors. Virtue, of course, being duh, or this moral charisma that we're going on about. So, what's this not being solitary thing all about? I think it's kind of self-evident if you translate duh as moral charisma. But in Confucius's time, many philosophers were talking about the meaning of duh and what gave someone this power, what kind of characteristics someone with a lot of it might show. One example is Lao Tzu, the guy whose work would later serve as the basis for Taoism. He also stressed the importance of cultivating duh, but his concept of it was very different from Confucius's. Remember, Confucius said duh is an attractive and social force, but Lao Tzu was a hermit. His reaction to the fragmented social order of 6th century BCE China was to hide away from the world. And that's also what the writings attributed to him encouraged people to do. He said it's best to distance yourself from worldly affairs. So for Confucius to say that duh is not solitary is a way of stressing its social nature. He believed duh must be involved with other people, and that you can't be your best self if you live a solitary life. Confucius even takes this one step further by saying that De always has neighbors. Since it's a social force, moral charisma can build a community as well as be amplified by a community. An individual's social context is crucial for cultivating morality, and Confucius explains repeatedly that we should surround ourselves with exemplary persons who can challenge us to be better, rather than give in to the easy and ego-stroking instinct to spend time with those to whom we feel superior. The first passage in Chapter 4 states the importance of choosing the right neighborhood. Your neighborhood, physically or metaphorically, the people in your orbit, are the same people you learn to emulate, and the people who learn to emulate you. The best way to become a wise, kind, and caring person is to surround yourself with wise, kind, and caring people. And this has a flywheel effect. Remember, passage 1.1 about friends coming from afar and passage 2.1 comparing a great leader to the North Star both make the point that those with De will naturally gravitate toward those with De. As I look back at this section, I think this sure is a tough nut to crack. I'm glad you stuck with me, and I hope a few of the points I made are going to serve you well in future episodes. In fact, I'm looking ahead at the very next phrase about how a guy named Ran Yong could be made to face south. And without going into any real detail, I think this one is going to give you a real head start there. Let's move on to linguistic notes. I mean, as if this whole episode hasn't already been one extended linguistic note. We're going to talk about 3 characters, gu, bi, and lin. All of these are frequently seen in modern Chinese and really retain the meanings we found here in passage 4.25. Gu is literally an orphan. It's composed of 2 parts, zi, meaning a child, and gua, a melon. The second part, melon, is the phonetic element, meaning it's supposed to give us some clue about how the character is pronounced. So anyway, by merit of the fact that an orphan is alone in some sense, it's sometimes used to mean solitary. It has the same meaning in some compound words in modern Chinese. For example, gudu means lonely. Next, bi means must, will, or certainly. You'll find it's the character xin, heart or mind, with an additional stroke through the center. So it's not much of a stretch to understand that it has to do with someone's will or willingness to do something. In modern Chinese, the word 必须 means must, and 不必 means need not. Finally, lin, composed of 2 components, lin on the left-hand side as a phonetic element, and fu on the right-hand side, which is a settlement such as a village or city. This simply means things in close proximity, things that are adjacent, such as people who live next to one another, or countries that share a border. In modern Chinese, linju is the word for neighbor, where ju means a residence or to dwell. Last up, I'll leave you with a few quick notes about 425's place in the Analects and clarify the major interpretations of this phrase. Many scholars believe Book 4 to be the first book of the Analects to be written. It has a strong focus on what causes people to be wise, humane, sincere, and dedicated, as well as what can cause people not to develop these qualities. Like 425, there are many statements about the best environment in which to cultivate oneself, as well as advice on how to recognize like-minded people. The book begins with a statement about the importance of environment. I mentioned it above, but I'll read Professor Pei Min Ni's translation here as well. Human-heartedness is what constitutes the excellence of a neighborhood. One who chooses a dwelling place, not among the human-hearted, how can such a person be wise? And this is the negative version of the point in 4.25. Anyone who lives in a chaotic environment and among people who can't nurture them will have trouble thriving. Finally, I'll just clarify one more time that there are a few different ways to understand how 425 is focused. We've already mentioned two, the first being that De is social by nature. It can't grow in a solitary state, and it thrives with others around. The second is that De is a gravitational force. If others are not around it, they will be attracted by its power. There's one other interesting interpretation mentioned by Edward Slingerland. This is via Qing Dynasty Confucian scholar Liu Baonan. He interpreted solitary as one-sided, indicating that De would never appear only externally or internally within an individual. So one who exhibited De would have it both within and without. Personally, I have to disagree with this interpretation, and I think Confucius would have too. We'll see in later passages that it's easy for someone to display the trappings of virtue, while at the same time actually being a so-called petty roux. Again, this is your host, Elliot Bernstein. I hope you enjoyed this 5th episode of Exploring the Analects. Next, we'll read passage 6.1, another 6-character phrase in which Confucius comments on the qualities of a great leader. See you there.